Good morning. I'm going to explain today the second document in chapter 15. This document is about cyclic evolution of the ovarian hormones. As we discussed in document 1, that the ovaries and the uterus are characterized by a cyclic and synchronized modifications. We're going to study in this document more about the relationship that exists between these two organs, and we're going to study more about the nature of this relationship. But before we start by the first document, which is document A, let's revise important terms. I'll start first by exocrine and endocrine glands. What are exocrine glands? Exocrine glands are glands that secrete juices, and those glands, they maintain contact with the body surface by a duct or an epithelial tube that directs secretions to the surface. So their secretions are not released into bloodstreams. Example about exocrine glands are the teary glands, the sweaty glands, and the mammary glands. For example, the mammary glands, they secrete milk, and milk is transported or conducted by certain ducts and not by blood. Whereas endocrine glands are glands that secrete hormones. They secrete chemical messengers that are called hormones, and those glands, they have no ducts and they do not have contact with the body surface or cavities which lead to the outside. So as you can see in the figures, we have the exocrine gland. It produces chemicals, and those chemicals are not transported by blood, they are transported by duct, whereas an endocrine gland is usually present in a vascularized area, in an area that is rich in blood vessels and blood capillaries, and those glands and all endocrine glands, they release or they secrete hormones into blood stream. So here is a table that compares between exocrine and endocrine glands. Exocrine glands, they secrete chemicals or juices by ducts. Endocrine glands are ductless. Exocrine glands, they secrete a variety of things from enzymes to mucus, whereas endocrine glands, they secrete only hormones. Exocrine gland, they secrete onto an epithelial surface and they release their secretions into ducts, whereas endocrine glands, they secrete hormones and chemical messengers into blood. Exocrine gland, it's located over a target organ. For example, the salivary glands that secrete the saliva, they are found inside our mouth cavity. So they are found beside the target, which is the mouth cavity, whereas endocrine glands are usually located away from the target because they can communicate by blood. Some examples about exocrine glands are the sweaty glands, the lacrimal glands in the eyes that secrete tears, and the pancreas that secrete digestive juices. And those digestive juices, as we discussed before, they are transported by ducts into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. Whereas some examples about endocrine glands are the ovaries, that we're going to study more about them in this document, the pancreas that secretes some hormones, and one of these hormones is the insulin, and the testicles that secrete testosterone, which is the male sex hormone that's transported by bloodstream. So when I say endocrine, I mean it's a gland. An endocrine gland is a gland, it's an organ that secretes hormones which travel by bloodstream. So the endocrine system is a collection of glands that secrete chemical messages. We call them hormones. These signals are passed through the blood to arrive at a target organ which has cell possessing the appropriate receptor. As you can see in this figure, we have a secreting cell. This cell is an endocrine cell. This cell secretes a chemical messenger that travels by bloodstream. We do not have ducts. The cell secretes the chemicals into blood. So blood means endocrine. So here we have a blood communication. This hormone, which is a chemical messenger, doesn't act on all cells inside our body. Each hormone acts on a specific target cell, and this target cell should have specific receptor for this hormone. Now, the hormones inside our body, they are classified as steroid hormones or non-steroid hormones. The non-steroid hormones, they are the hormones that whose receptors are found on the cell membrane. So they bind, or the binding between the hormone and the receptor occurs outside the cell. For example, insulin and adrenaline, which is the stress hormone. And those hormones are always made up of amino acids, so they are protein-based hormones. Whereas steroid hormones, such as sex hormones, testosterone in males, estrogen and progesterone in females, they are made up from cholesterol. Because of that, they are called steroid. Example, testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. And those hormones, they have receptors that are found inside the cell and not on the cell membrane as the non-steroid hormones. Now, what about the mode of action or the mechanism of action of steroid and non-steroid hormones? I'll start by the non-steroid hormones. So the non-steroid hormones, we have a cell membrane. This is the cell membrane. This cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. So it is a layer. It contains of two layers that are rich in lipids. It's a bilayer that contain lipids. So because of that, the non-steroid hormones that are made up usually of amino acids, they cannot cross the lipid or the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. Because of that, those hormones have receptors that are found on the cell membrane. So all non-steroid hormones, they bind on specific receptors that are found on specific target cells, and those receptors are found on the cell membrane and not internally inside the cell. The binding between this hormone and its specific receptor causes an activation of certain enzymes, and this will alter the cellular function. For example, insulin, let's take an example. Insulin is one of the non-steroid hormones that is found inside our body. For example, when insulin binds to its specific receptor, there is activation of certain enzymes, and because of that, the target cell will absorb the excess glucose in blood. So this is the mechanism of action of non-steroid hormones. Now, how does a steroid hormone act? Steroid hormones, as we said before, they are made up of cholesterol. So because they are made up of cholesterol, they can cross the phospholipid bilayer. So any steroid hormone can first diffuse through the plasma membrane of target cells. It enters inside the nucleus, or it binds to a certain receptor that is bind, as you can see here. The receptor of the steroid hormone is found in the cytoplasm. Now this complex, which is composed of the receptor and the hormone, they can bind to DNA, and this activates the synthesis of new proteins. So this will initiate transcription and translation. Now, concerning the ovarian hormones that are estrogen and progesterone, those hormones are steroid hormones. They are made up from cholesterol, and they are carried by a carrier proteins to circulate in blood, and they can cross the cell membrane that contain lipids to bind to their intracellular receptors, and they can then activate a certain gene, and they can initiate the transcription and translation. Now, so endocrine glands are glands that secrete their chemical substances, which are called hormones, directly into blood. So a hormone is a chemical messenger. It's a signaling molecule. We can say that a hormone is a signaling molecule, or it's a chemical that's made up by a specialized cells that are called endocrine cells. Those cells are found within endocrine glands, and a hormone is released into the bloodstream to send a message to another part of the body. If this hormone is a non-steroid hormone, it's found freely inside our blood because this hormone is made up of amino acids and it's soluble in blood, which mainly contains water. Whereas if this hormone is a steroid hormone that is made up of lipids, then it cannot be transported through blood that contains water because of that steroid hormones are transported by carrier proteins inside the bloodstream. Now, some important notes that we will use in the deduction of some experiments in this chapter. The first one, ablation of an organ in an experiment. In the significance, we have to mention the role of the ablated organ. The experimental ablation and grafting, in the significance, we should mention the role of the ablated organ is through blood or blood communication, and experimental ablation followed by injection. In the significance, we should mention the role of the ablated organ, that is through chemical substance secreted through blood. Miss, you're going to see how can we use such sentences in writing a significance. Now, document A, the first document in the first experiment in this document, it's document A, experiments representing the relationship between the ovaries and the uterus. So in this experiment, the aim of the experiment is to find the relationship between the ovaries and the uterus. We're going to write the deduction of this experiment. So when I say deduce, I have to interpret the experiments and then to write a conclusion. So analyze, significance, and conclusion. بالanalysis, it's very necessary to compare. لأنه here we have 4 different experiments, so we should write a comparative analysis. I'm going to start by the first experiment. I have to say that the bilateral, or by the second experiment, the bilateral ovariectomy leads to the absence of development of endometrium. So, by significance, I have to say this means that the ovaries affect the development of the uterus while the ovary graft re-establishes communication between the ovaries and the uterus. This shows that the communication between these organs is ensured by blood. So when you compare the second and the third experiment, you can see in the second experiment that without the ovaries, there is no development in the uterus. And in experiment 3, when we remove the ovaries and graft them under the skin, there is cyclic development of the uterus. So as the result of experiment 1. So this experiment, which is experiment 3, ensures that there is communication between ovaries and the uterus, and this communication is ensured through blood. If I go back to the endocrine and the exocrine glands, we said before that an endocrine gland can act in any vascularized area, and here we have communication by blood. Now, however, the injection of ovarian extracts partially establishes the communication. So in the last experiment, the ovariectomy and then daily constant injections of ovarian extracts lead to the development of the endometrium, but without cyclic variation. So the significance here is that the ovarian extracts include chemical substances that ensure communication between the uterus and the ovaries. So here the ovarian extracts contain certain chemicals or chemical substances that ensure the communication between the ovaries and the uterus. Unlike the ovarian graft, the injection of the ovarian extracts in constant doses doesn't provoke cyclic variations. This shows that the ovarian extracts remain variable during the cycle. So here we have also a significance that we can write by comparing here that we have cyclic development of the endometrium in a lot of control mice that have ovaries, and in the fourth experiment where we have constant injection of ovarian extract, there is no cyclic variation in the endometrium. Those cyclic variations in the endometrium, they are ensured by variable amount of ovarian extracts. Because of that, I wrote this shows that the ovarian extracts remain variable during the cycle. Now, what's the conclusion from this document? On a new line, I can write, therefore, the ovary influences the uterus through chemical substances discharged periodically in blood. كيف أنا عرفت chemical substance؟ from experiment 3 from experiment 4 لأنه in experiment 4 after the injection of ovarian extract there is endometrial development. And why did I write in the conclusion that in blood? So كيف عرفت أنا إنه هالcommunication بين in blood from experiment 3 لأنه the graft of the in the ovaries in a vascularized area leads to a cyclic development of the endometrium. وكمان why did I mention the term periodically لأنه from experiment 4 عرفنا إنه constant injection of ovarian extract doesn't lead to a cyclic variation. So the ovarian extracts are discharged periodically in a variable amount. They are not released into blood in a constant amount. Now let's talk more about the ovarian extracts or the ovarian hormones. So إذا بترجعوا للsignificance here in أنا I didn't mention the term hormone. You have only to write the term ovarian extract or chemical substances. Don't use the term hormone. Now, let's explain more about the ovarian hormones. Ovarian hormones are estrogen and progesterone. I'm going to talk first about the mode of action of estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is one of the steroid hormones inside our body. So it's found, it's synthesized from cholesterol. So estrogen receptors, because of that, as any steroid hormone, it has receptors inside the cell. The estrogen receptors are normally reside inside the cell's nucleus with the DNA molecule. When estrogen diffuses across the cell membrane, it can pass into the nucleus. It binds to its specific receptor, and this will initiate a response inside the cell. Certain genes become activated, transcription and translation occur, and this will influence the cell behavior. Now, concerning progesterone, also progesterone has receptors inside the cell. It can bind to DNA. This will initiate protein synthesis or transcription and translation. Because of that, the messenger RNA amount will increase, and this will lead to multiplication of the superficial layer cells of the endometrium. So here, and I'm explaining how does estrogen leads to multiplication of superficial layer and progesterone. So when estrogen bound to its receptor inside the cell, this complex اللي هو receptor of estrogen and estrogen will bind to DNA. They will trigger transcription and translation. This will lead to multiplication of cells اللي هن cells of the endometrium, and this will lead to proliferation of the endometrium. Now, the characteristics of the follicular phase and the luteal phase. The follicular phase is characterized by a unique secretion of estradiol. This secretion persists throughout the cycle and undergoes important variation. As you can see in the curve, there is a peak at day 13 of the cycle. Why? Because estrogen is produced by follicular cells and internal theca, and the follicle reaches its maximum size at day 13, where we have the maximum number of follicular cells. So we have a maximum secretion of estrogen hormone. Because of that, we can see the peak at day 13. Now, the luteal phase is characterized by the secretion of a large amount of progesterone. So in the luteal phase, we can see that there is secretion of progesterone because progesterone is only secreted by corpus luteum that is only present after day 14. So progesterone is only present after day 14 in the luteal phase. And this corpus luteum also secretes a low amount of estrogen. So as you can see, estrogen is present within the all days inside the sexual cycle, whereas progesterone is only present in large quantities in the luteal phase or in the post-ovulatory phase. So in the pre-ovulatory phase, we have only estrogen secreted by follicular cells and internal theca, and in the post-ovulatory phase, we have estrogen and progesterone that are both secreted by corpus luteum inside the ovary. Now, a table that compares between estrogen and progesterone concerning the cells that secrete these hormones and the biological effects of these hormones. This table is very, very important. So, the cells that secrete estrogen are the granulosa cells or the follicular cells, internal theca. Those cells are present in the follicular or in the pre-ovulatory phase, and also corpus luteum that's present in the post-ovulatory phase or in the luteal phase can also secrete estrogen, whereas progesterone is only secreted by corpus luteum. Now, what about the biological effects of hormones? Estrogen causes the proliferation of the uterine and the vaginal mucosa. As you can see here, estrogen induces and causes proliferation of the mucosa, the proliferation of the superficial layer of the endometrium by activating the genes and initiating transcription and translation and cellular proliferation. Now, also estrogen leads to the development of tube-like glands in the endometrium. It leads to the development of cervical glands, and it leads to the growth of blood vessels, whereas progesterone leads to the stimulation of a gland secretion in the uterine mucosa and the cervix. The glands in the uterine mucosa in the luteal phase, they secrete nutrients and especially glycogen that is necessary for the nourishment of the growing embryo in case of implantation. Progesterone also leads to the development of spiral arterioles. It causes an increase in the body temperature, and because of that, the body temperature of the female, the internal body temperature of the female, is higher in the post-ovulatory phase or in the luteal phase, and progesterone finally inhibits uterine contraction. You have to memorize the name of the cells that secrete these hormones and also some of their biological effects. Now, what happens to the level of these hormones before and after menopause? Before menopause, there is a cyclic variation in the level of these hormones. And these hormones, they have variable amounts during different dates within the cycle. So as I mentioned before, estrogen is present in the follicular phase. It's secreted by the granulosa cell and by the follicular cells, and its amount increases till reaching a peak at day 13, and estrogen is also present in the luteal phase. So here is day 14. Whereas progesterone is only present after day 14 or in the post-ovulatory phase. So the amount of progesterone is nil or null in the pre-ovulatory phase. In the post-ovulatory phase, it's secreted in by a high amount by the corpus luteum inside the ovary. Now, but after menopause, what happens to the level of these hormones? After menopause, the level of these hormones is reduced to null. So as you can see, the level of these hormones become null or nil. Why? Because there is no more structures, there is no more follicular cells, and there is no more corpus luteum to secrete these hormones. So before menopause, we have a cyclic variation during the menstrual cycle. We have a cyclic variation in the level of these hormones. In the follicular phase, we have only estrogen that reaches its peak at day 13. And in the luteal phase, we have secretion of estrogen and more secretions of progesterone. Whereas after menopause, where there is no menstrual cycle and where there is no more follicles inside the ovaries, so these hormones cannot be secreted. Because of that, the level of these hormones is reduced to null. Now, the last document represents the synchronism of the ovarian and the uterine cycle. So in this slide, we're going to explain about the synchronism of the ovarian and the uterine cycles. You'll see that the cycles, the ovarian and the uterine cycles, they occur, certain changes occur in a parallel manner, and this is called synchronism. Let's start first by the follicular phase or by the pre-ovulatory phase. So I'm going to start by the changes that occur before day 14 or before ovulation in the pre-ovulatory phase. Inside the ovaries, we have growing follicles. Okay? This growing follicle is producing only estrogen. So during the follicular phase, only estrogen hormones are produced by the developing follicles. The internal theca and the granulosa are the cells that produce estrogen. At the beginning, the blood level of these hormones rises progressively. Then there is a quiet rapidly towards the end of the phase. So at the beginning, there is a progressive increase in the level of estrogen, and then at day 13 or at the end of the follicular phase, there is a rapid increase in the level of secreted estrogen. Now, estrogen hormone is responsible for the proliferation of the endometrium. So the secretion of estrogen induces the thickening of the proliferation of the uterine mucosa. So during the follicular phase, at the level of the uterus, we have during the first few days menstruation, the uterus will get rid of the blood vessels that are secreted a cycle from the cycle before, and then after menses, there is a proliferative phase where there is a proliferation of the blood vessel in the functional layer. Now, at ovulation, the developed follicle will rupture, releasing the gamete, which is the oocyte 2, that's blocked at metaphase 2 into the oviduct, and ovulation now induces a decrease in the secretion of estrogen. Now, what happens in the luteal phase or in the post-ovulatory phase? During the luteal phase, the corpus luteum produces a great amount of estrogen and progesterone. Progesterone reinforces the impact of estrogen on the endometrium. In fact, these hormones prepare the uterus to receive the embryo and maintain it in a secreting state. Because of that, this phase is called the secretory phase. So in the post-ovulatory phase, there is a gradual transformation of the broken follicle into a corpus luteum, which secretes a high amount of progesterone and a low amount of estrogen. The joint secretion of ovarian hormones makes the mucosa thicker. Because of that, this phase is called the secretory phase, and this secretion reaches its maximum when the corpus luteum becomes fully developed, which is at day 21. Now, after the gradual disappearance, if there is no fertilization, the corpus luteum will gradually disappear. It will become a white body that's called corpus albicans. Because of that, the secretion of these hormones will decrease. So when corpus luteum degenerate, the secretion of ovarian hormones is reduced. The fall in the level of hormones provoke the destruction of the mucosa, and this will lead to menstruation or to bleeding. So at the end of the cycle, if there is no fertilization, the corpus luteum degenerates within a few days, and due to this regression, the concentration of the ovarian hormones in the blood fall, and this will result in menstruation. So as you can see, the synchronism in the follicular phase, we have a growing follicle, and at the same time there is proliferation in the uterine mucosa, and in the luteal phase or in the post-ovulatory phase, there is corpus luteum from the day of ovulation till day 21, where the corpus luteum is fully developed. And here we have a secretory phase where there is more and more proliferation of the blood vessels, and there is appearance of certain glands that secrete nutrients, and the appearance also of spiral arterioles. And then if there is no fertilization, when inside the ovaries, when corpus luteum degenerates to become corpus albicans, at the same time, in a synchronized manner also, here we have a regression or a reduction in the ovarian hormones, and this will lead to menstruation. So this slide includes all the notes that I discussed in this figure. So I want from you to always remember that the secretion of estrogen increases in parallel with the follicular development, and as the developed follicle bursts during ovulation, its rupture induces the decrease in the secretion of estrogen, and the gradual transformation of the broken follicle into a corpus luteum stimulates the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, and this secretion reaches its maximum when the corpus luteum becomes fully developed. Furthermore, the gradual disappearance of corpus luteum decreases, then stops the secretion of hormones. And affected by the first peak of estrogen, the uterine mucosa thickens progressively, and this phase is called the proliferation phase. Then the joint secretion of progesterone and estrogen after ovulation makes the mucosa thicker more and more, and this phase is called the secretory phase. And finally, at the end of the cycle, the fall in the levels of ovarian hormones provoke the destruction of the mucosa, thus resulting in bleeding or menstruation. Thank you.